Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. Hope you had a great weekend. I know that Brett Kavanaugh did not, and we're going to spend some time talking about that today. And if you'd like to join us, I would really love to hear from you. I know that usually this hour we don't get lots of phone calls. This would be one time when I'd love to hear from you about whether or not you believe some of the things being said by Christine Blasey Ford or by Judge Kavanaugh. And we have another situation that, for those of us that are a little bit older, reminds us a great deal of the Clarence Thomas hearings. Matter of fact, I love our friend Jim Garrity put it this way: this week will make the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings look civil and agreeable. I'll come back to that in just a minute. But again, if you are not familiar with what is taking place, and I'm sure that you probably have, because apart from Hurricane Florence, almost all the other news stories had something to do with he said, she said, and that has to do with the fact that Judge Brett Kavanaugh, who is supposed to be voted on later this week in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as I understand, still is a possibility. There is, of course, the accusation, which at first came out in an anonymous form in the New York Times, and now this individual, Christine Blasey Ford, has actually come forward. Turns out she's a research psychologist at Palo Alto University, which is in the Palo Alto area in California, and actually said the things that you have heard before about this teenager, high school student, pinning her on the bed and groping her. So this has been enough for at least some to say maybe we're not going to have a vote. Jeff Flake of Arizona told Political he's not comfortable voting yes on the nomination until he's heard about Ms. Ford's account. There is all the evidence in the world that she will testify, and Brett Kavanaugh says he's willing to testify on the woman's allegations. So that is kind of where we find ourselves right now. Another Republican on the panel, Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, who, by the way, has other things to worry about right now in terms of a hurricane and now tropical storm that has hit his coast, nevertheless said, if Ms. Ford wishes to provide information to the committee, I would gladly listen to what she has to say and compare that against all other information we've received about Judge Kavanaugh. You have to, of course, at some point say, if indeed this allegation is so severe and significant, why did we see that Dianne Feinstein, Senator Feinstein, waited till the 11th hour to drop it? And, of course, even if it turns out that this is a false allegation, there is a sense in which I have talked about before in some of my commentaries that every time an allegation comes out like that, it's like opening a feather pillow in the wind. You can never get all the feathers back into the pillow. And I've used that as an illustration because one of the individuals who had to step down and not be confirmed in the Trump cabinet did so simply because of allegations his wife had made years ago on the Oprah Winfrey Show. Shortly thereafter said it was not true. She was told by her divorce attorney that this would help her in the settlement, and has spent the rest of her life trying to, if you will, collect all the feathers from that pillow. But if you, again, type in the name of that individual that was supposed to be in the Trump cabinet, you will see that the first things that pop up in a Google search are the interviews that were on Oprah Winfrey, which on numerous occasions his former wife has said were not true and regrets it. But, of course, there it's out there. If you don't think that this has a life of its own, think of Clarence Thomas. Those of you that are a little bit older might remember that during the 1990s. We were doing a broadcast then. Marlon Maddox was the host. Remember sitting there with Penna Dexter and John Clemens and all sorts of other individuals talking about some of the allegations that come at that time from, again, an individual by the name of Anita Hill. And these allegations didn't seem to have merit, but it was given enough credence that to this day, if you, again, type in on, say, YouTube, the name Clarence Thomas, you will see various films, documentaries, videos, and others taking her side of the story. And I think it's worth mentioning, since that was more than 20 years ago, almost a quarter of a century ago, a lot of our audience, young enough, might even know what was the big issue. And the issue was that Clarence Thomas spent some time, apparently, according to her testimony, talking with Anita Hill about pornography, which I think some of our millennials go, really? Was that it? Well, yes, you got to understand, back then, somebody was admitting to watching pornography. Maybe that was a reason enough to throw them off the Supreme Court. You got to realize just a few years before, one of the individuals that was nominated by Ronald Reagan stepped down because we turned out that he actually had smoked marijuana, and that was enough for him to actually step down as well. Those of you that are a little bit younger probably just shake your head saying, really? Is that really the case? Yes, that really is the case. But anyway, let's get back to the issue at hand, and I want to spend some time trying to sort it out in a way that brings at least some clarity to the issue. And again, the argument that is being made right now by Christine Blasey Ford is that sometime around a certain date, she's not really sure which date, but she says it was around the end of her sophomore year. She's not real sure about the exact location, who owned the house, or how she got there. Okay, so recognizing that memories are hazy, you might remember the one that's traumatic, but of course, this is the perfect allegation that you cannot defend against, because if she said it happened, say, in 1982 in the house owned by the Hills, Brett Kavanaugh could say, wait a minute, I've never been into that house, end of discussion. Or 1982, and it was June of 1982, and he says, wait a minute, I wasn't in school at that time. My dad took me to Europe. Or this was in January of 1982. Well, wait a minute, I was with Model UN, and we actually were at the United Nations in New York, so I know I wasn't there that weekend. Do you see the point? I mean, the ambiguity of the account itself almost makes it impossible to dismiss. And, of course, you have some other issues as well, because this is, 36 years after the event, which were not reported, at least in terms of a counseling situation, until just a few years ago. So you've got what almost becomes a bulletproof allegation, and one that becomes very difficult for Judge Brett Kavanaugh to defend. Now, he says he's willing to testify on this, and he says this is a completely false allegation. I have never done anything like what the accuser describes to her or to anyone. Because this never happened, I had no idea who was making this accusation until she identified herself yesterday. So that's the comment made from him. Now, when we come back, I want to try to sort this out, because she is serious about this, making a serious allegation. It has been reported that the Washington Post even had her do a polygraph test, and that she passed that. So she believes that this happened, and she seems to be telling the truth. So we set aside some of the other kinds of arguments people are making. Brett Kavanaugh said this did not happen. And unless he can make some kind of statement like, look, I never went to a party, I never was drunk, which some of us could make that statement, most could not, and I'm sure he probably could not, then where do we go from here? So I want to help you maybe think about how to sort this out, and one of the articles we've posted on our website probably will help you do that. But let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll spend some time looking at the allegations, trying to weigh how we reevaluate and evaluate them. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Later this week, the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee vote on the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh. We may be treated to more of the antics that took place during the confirmation hearings. If so, that will provide yet one more reason why the Senate leadership should get rid of the confirmation hearings. Even when there aren't all the theatrics, the confirmation hearings aren't very helpful. This time you had Democrats ask Judge Kavanaugh essentially the same questions over and over about abortion and guns. He wasn't going to give conclusive answers no matter how many times you repeated the question. All of that goes back to what some have called the Ginsburg rule established by Senator Joseph Biden back when Ruth Bader Ginsburg appeared before the committee. Republicans and Democrats can debate whether the so-called rule should apply, but we all know that the nominee isn't going to answer specific questions. And it's worth noting that most of the senators asking questions already made up their minds, even though that didn't stop many of them from complaining that they only had 500,000 documents. Another obvious reason for ending these hearings is the fact that they have been the occasion for lots of political grandstanding. Senators Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and Richard Blumenthal provided numerous examples of political posturing and media manipulation. But it was more than just the interruptions and motions to adjourn. Once the hearings got underway, we had to listen to speeches by each and every member of the committee. Very few were even worth remembering. Most were forgettable and irritating. Finally, we need to acknowledge that the confirmation hearings have become a circus, with apologies to people who work in a circus. On the first day of the hearing, 70 were arrested. It didn't get much better the rest of the week, and outside you had people dressed in costumes yelling and screaming. I'm ready to eliminate these Senate hearings, and I suspect many Americans agree with me. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Universal 1440, Unbroken, Path to Redemption, the rest of World War II hero Louis Zamperini's true story, now playing, rated PG-13.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Do you tend to believe the various claims that are being made right now by Christine Blasey Ford, or the repudiation of that and a rejection of that by Judge Brett Kavanaugh? I'd love to hear your comments, 1-800-351-1212. Also, of course, we broadcast on Facebook Live, and I'll look and see if any of you would like to leave some comments there as well. One of the articles I wanted to post is our good friend David French. It's amazing how many times we come back to him, but again, I just appreciate his common sense look at the issues. And because he is certainly no fan of Donald Trump, that will become evident in just a minute, by the way, because he even thought about running against Donald Trump. I love to use him as a foil. Nobody can say that, he's a pro-Trumper, not hardly, but he's not a complete anti-Trumper, never Trumper either, because in some cases he will acknowledge positives and things of that nature. But he said, how can we weigh the allegations against Brett Kavanaugh? And as we were thinking about this, I found that some of the ideas that I was going to express, he expresses in already a written piece, so I thought, why not just use his? And first of all, he says these allegations are serious but not solid. They're serious but not substantive. So first of all, we want to start with the assumption that when you hear these kinds of allegations, we take them seriously. As I've pointed out before here at Point of View, our May issue of Outlook was about the Me Too movement. So we don't brush those off and say, wait a minute, she's probably just lying. No, you take those seriously. There's every reason to do so. And these come from an individual that isn't in a mental clinic or isn't dealing with some kind of emotional trauma, although she apparently did go for counseling over the emotional trauma.
but is a professor at Palo Alto University. So let's give credit where credit is due. And so I think David French, I'll just skip a couple of paragraphs and jump down to about the 5th paragraph where he says, "Don't count me among those who would minimize this alleged assault." He said, "I went to high school that had more than its share of drunken parties, and my classmates could do crazy and stupid things, but an act like this was beyond the pale. It wasn't boys being boys. Actions have consequences. It's hardly unjust to tell a person that if he mistreated another in person like this, even a long time ago, he has to remain merely a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Since Kavanaugh has denied the story, however, the question of whether the event is so egregious that it should disqualify him is moot. At the very least, if the attack happened, he should be disqualified for lying." Okay, so let's kind of get into how do we evaluate this? He says, unless all parties start telling the same story, there's no way to know for certain if this event occurred. We don't need certainty, however, to make a decision on whether a man should sit on the Supreme Court. And now he's going to take us through his thought process, which is similar to kind of what I would say, because he says, I have the same standard for Judge Brett Kavanaugh as I did for Roy Moore, Donald Trump, and Bill Clinton. And I appreciate he bringing those individuals up, or for any other politician who's accused of misconduct. Is it more likely than not that the allegation is true? And the point is just the claim is not enough to disqualify an individual. You have to evaluate the claim. And in some cases, there are some reasons why we can evaluate that without calling anybody a liar in this situation. But let's kind of work our way through this. Okay, back to David French. He says, given the totality of evidence, I believe it is more likely than not that Bill Clinton committed rape and sexual harassment. I thought that was interesting because the other day I saw a post by Juanita Broaddrick. She was responding to one by Senator Dick Durbin, and so I made a screen capture of it because I was afraid it might evaporate. And Senator Dick Durbin said, if the Me Too movement has taught us anything, it is that we must respect and listen to survivors of sexual assault, regardless of the age of those involved or when the alleged attack took place. So Juanita Broaddrick commented to that by saying, well, Juanita Broaddrick says, well, Dick, I do have a story for you. Once upon a time, Bill Clinton raped me. By the way, she's not the only one. Kathleen Willey and some others could be in that list as well. So this is why, in case you haven't, and again, a lot of this happened in the 1990s. We did cover it in some detail, but I recognize the age of our audience might be, I don't remember any of that. But nevertheless, back to the point, that is, David French says, I believe it is more likely than not that Bill Clinton committed rape and sexual harassment. He says, I believe it more likely than not that Donald Trump has committed sexual assault. And he says, I believe it more likely than not that Roy Moore engaged in sexual misconduct with underage girls. So again, we've talked about this on this program, and sometimes people have said, yeah, but that was a long time ago. Well, so was this. But here's now how you evaluate that. Why could he make those statements and still say the jury's out with Brett Kavanaugh? And he said the evidence against Kavanaugh falls far short of the evidence arrayed against each one of these men. So far, at least, it falls short of the evidence against virtually any other politician or celebrity who has faced consequences during the Me Too movement. Here's why. Point number one. One way to help test the veracity of old claims is to ask whether there are any contemporaneous corroboration. Did the accuser tell a friend or a family member or anyone about the alleged assault when it occurred? Doesn't mean it didn't occur, but it certainly helps when you have collaboration. With Clinton, Trump, and Moore, and many other politicians and celebrities, David French says, there was ample contemporaneous corroboration. Here, there was not. According to the Washington Post, Ford said she told no one of the incident in any detail until 2012, when she was in a couples therapy with her husband. As David French says, that's almost 3 decades of silence, 3 decades when memories can grow cloudy and recollections can change. Next hour, we're going to be talking about the subject of shame, and one of the things I want to ask Dr. Baker is, sometimes people do suppress all those memories and don't say anything about it. But that's at least one point on one side to begin to think. Now, second point.
Even the alleged corroborating notes of the therapist raise a separate question. They actually contradict her story on a key detail. According to the Post, the notes say that 4 boys were involved, a discrepancy that Ford says was an error on the therapist's part. Ford said there were 4 boys at the party, but only 2 in the room. Nor do the notes mention Kavanaugh's name, even though her husband said Ford said Kavanaugh in the sessions. Okay, so that's, again, but again, what David French points out is these are important discrepancies. And if 6 years ago she told the therapist 4 men and says 2 men now, that suggests that her memory of the event may be suspect. As a former trial lawyer, he said, I can tell you that while neither notes nor memories are infallible, in a contest between contemporaneous notes and later verbal testimony about those notes, the content of the verbal or the written notes usually prevails over the verbal ones. Juries are extremely skeptical of witnesses who contradict written notes. After all, the notes were taken when the words were immediate. There isn't any overwhelming pressure of a trial to conform your testimony to the desired outcome. At least the investigation seems somewhat manageable. If there were only 4 boys there, who were the other 2? Let's hear from them. In fact, investigators should interview everyone else at the party, if they really want to get to the bottom of it, of course. Let's go back to David French. Given all the years that have passed, would it be possible to find anyone who remembers being at the party? Would they remember any details of it? If someone saw Kavanaugh stumbling drunk at the party, would that bolster Ford's account? If another attendee say he was totally sober and he was with me the whole time, that helps Kavanaugh. But the odds of getting details that precise are long indeed, and there is always a chance that a motivated classmate might lie for either person. Finally, there are no other allegations of sexual misconduct against Kavanaugh. There's one thing we've seen time and time again. It's that one allegation often triggers a cascade of additional claims. There seems to be precious few men who engage in serious sexual misconduct just once. If this was the kind of behavior that Kavanaugh engaged in, then look for more people to come forward. If no one does, however, we're left with a sole claim made by an opposing partisan. Ford is an outspoken progressive, that Kavanaugh strenuously denies, that lacks any contemporaneous corroboration, and is contradicted in material respects by her therapist's own notes. Doesn't add up to more likely than not. But he says these conclusions are tentative and preliminary. The next 3 days are crucial. We'll likely hear more from Ford. I expect we'll hear more from Kavanaugh, and we now know that is the case. People who were at the party may come forward with their own accounts. The news cycle is moving so fast it's almost absurd to speculate about the state of our knowledge even 24 hours from now. But if this is the core evidence supporting the very serious claim against Kavanaugh, it's not sufficient to derail the nomination of a man with an otherwise sterling record of professional excellence and personal integrity. I think that's well said. Now, you may agree or disagree with some of the comments about Bill Clinton and Roy Moore and some of the others, although I think they're pretty much on target. But when we come back, a couple other points. We have a series of women that have come forward to say, this is not the Brett Kavanaugh we know, but I want to respond to some of the criticisms of that letter. All that coming up right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Please, if you could, give us a call. Love to know your thoughts about this. Again, that number, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about, of course, Judge Brett Kavanaugh and the allegations against him. And if you'd like to leave a note on our Facebook Live post, that's available as well. Let me also encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net. And one of the articles we've posted, of course, I just quoted from by David French, How to Weigh the Allegations. Another one is What's in It for Republicans. Now, Senator Dianne Feinstein last week threw what many people called a Hail Mary pass. And one of the people that decided to catch the Hail Mary pass is Dylan Matthews of Vox. And he posted this comment. He said, I honestly don't know what's in it for Republicans in continuing to back Kavanaugh. He withdraws. Trump appoints Kethledge, Hardiman, or Coney Barrett instead, and they confirm in the lame duck anyway. Plus, that way they don't smear a sexual assault accuser. So that got the attention of Charles Cook. And Charles Cook said, what's in it for Republicans? I love what he says here, a little bit of skepticism. You mean other than refusing to establish a precedent by which any nominee for anything can be vetoed by vague, anonymous, half-peddled, whisper-driven accusations? Of course, now she's not anonymous, but when this was written, it, I think, was still somewhat anonymous. And, of course, it started out that way, so it's still appropriate. He says if Kavanaugh withdraws now, while the charge against him remains glued to the shadows, he ensures that nobody in politics will ever again need to flesh out their accusations, and all but guarantees that the minority party in the Senate will be able to kill any figure at any time on the basis of nothing more than innuendo. I don't agree with that. It's only if the minority party is the Democratic Party. I mean, how many of these innuendos have you seen from Republicans? You know, look at the campaign against Judge Robert Bork, the claim that he was for back alley abortions, that he was going to reinstitute the various kinds of Jim Crow laws and all the other speeches given by Ted Kennedy and others. How about the allegations we just talked about a minute ago, Anita Hill against Clarence Thomas? These don't show up except when you have a Republican president nominating an individual. So, yes, it would certainly establish a very significant precedent. And if we can step back for just a minute, let's assume that this is not true, and this is an incredible smear that will hang over the head of Judge Brett Kavanaugh forever. Anybody that naively thinks that he will ever, in the court of public opinion, get a pass need only watch the late-night talk shows tonight. I guarantee you they're going to be making fun of him, and they're going to probably be documentaries, and there's going to be interviews done with this woman, and on and on and on. This will never, ever end. And as we've said on this program so many times before, it's the famous question that Ray Donovan asked years ago on the Reagan administration. Where'd I go to get my good name back? Because some false accusations ruined his reputation. I just mentioned another one of an individual that was not allowed to essentially serve in the Trump cabinet simply because his ex-wife opened up a feather pillow and all the feathers in the wind blew out and she could never collect them all back again. And so that's something else. He also says, I think Charles Cook says, it would be suicidal because it would ensure that 11th hour efforts would be marshaled against every qualified nominee from now until the end of time. And so there's just a lot of issues that you can begin to get into that. And notice that you even have some of these websites right now that actually have lines. We have a letter that shows Kavanaugh is a rapist. Okay, so, you know, can you go do a Google search right now, type in Kavanaugh, rapist, Kavanaugh, sexual assault. How many articles have posted? And I'm going to have to do that in the next couple of minutes just to see how many there are. And you can just see the reason why you really want to do the best you can to clear your name. But unfortunately, in this world, you may never actually be able to clear your name because of one individual by the name of Christine Blasey Ford in terms of her comments. is it possible that she's forgotten who that really was? You know, at the time, she thought it was Brett Kavanaugh, but it would have been one of those other 4 boys. He may not have been at the party, but she later on said, no, it was him. He looked like him. Maybe somebody even has a name Brett. Who knows? So there are just all sorts of things that are what ifs. We don't know. And in the next 24, 48 hours, maybe we'll know a little bit more. Maybe we'll be left with having to make the same kind of assessment that David French has. Anyway, let me finish with the piece by Charles Cook. He said, naturally, Republicans should refuse to be suckered into an immoral arrangement. If there is a case here, it should be publicly aired, publicly examined, publicly debated. I agree. While there is not the answer to any would-be short-circuiters, that is, having to withdraw, should be no, for any other path will lead down the path of superstition to caprice and ultimately to the habitual presumption of guilt. And the long-term losers from that transformation will look a lot different than Judge Kavanaugh. So, again, just one more piece on the table. Before I get to some other articles that we have posted today, let me try to respond to one other. And that is when this anonymous letter came out in first the New York Times, before we understood who this individual was. And, of course, now we know Mrs. Ford is the one that has done this. There was a letter that came out from 65 different women that have known Brett Kavanaugh either in high school, college, graduate school, have clerked with him for whatever. And one of the people that wrote a response to all of the allegations about this was Virginia Hume. Now, that last name may sound familiar. She is the daughter of Britt Hume at Fox, and I've known him since I was a vice president of student body and introduced him 40-plus years ago. So anyway, but she wrote a letter to explain that, and she said, I signed it, here's how it went down. On Thursday afternoon, Dianne Feinstein released a cryptic statement saying that she had submitted to federal investigators a letter from Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. Although the FBI quickly announced it would not pursue an investigation, speculation surfaced that the claims related to an incident of sexual misconduct dating to Kavanaugh's high school years. On Friday, a group of women who knew Brett in high school sent a letter in support of him to Senators Grassley and Feinstein. I'm one of those 65 women. Having seen some of the reaction to the letter, I'd like to clear up a few things. So here, just real quickly to clear up some of the things you may see on a Twitter post. And as you are on your Facebook or you see a Twitter post, you see one of these, this would be helpful to just know the background. First of all, the argument that came out here is that these were pre-planned. And so the allegations came out that indeed this was a pre-planned response. But she said, I learned about the letter from a friend and felon signatory on that Thursday. Others learned about it the same way. Those surprised at the speed with which it came together should see it as yet another testament to Brett's excellent reputation. So the fact that they were able to get their letter out of those 65 women so quickly, I think illustrates that it just was something that came together very quickly, essentially in cyberspace. She says, to those who responded to my tweet saying, I knew Brett in high school by asking if I had gender reassignment surgery. Don't you hate the comments that come out there on Twitter? She said, I went to an all-girls school in Bethesda. He went to an all-boys school in Bethesda. We were permitted upon occasion to speak to people of the opposite sex. Now, she says, to those hearing the thwop, thwop, thwop of black helicopters because my father is a journalist or because I worked in politics, she said in a group of 65 graduate of D.C. area schools, it would be odd not to find someone related to or working as a journalist or politician. It is entirely unremarkable. This is a company town. That said, it might explain why people happen to see my tweets on the subject. And then finally, she says, to the one person who said, I'm too young to know Brett Kavanaugh, truly, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Well, I got to love that. But nevertheless, that's a letter of 65 women who knew him. She says all in high school. I wasn't sure all of those 65 were all just knew him just from high school, but maybe some from later on, can testify to just the opposite. So, again, numbers mean nothing if there is a true allegation, but let's at least put in one column 65 women who knew Brett Kavanaugh that have never seen anything like that, and one woman on the other side, Christina Blasey Ford, who on the other side had something to say about that. So that's probably more information you wanted to know, but if you have been wondering how to think about this issue, I've certainly tried to put a lot on the table. And frankly, over the next couple of days, we're going to hear a lot more about that. When we come back, one of the other articles we've posted is that Nike is winning the Colin Kaepernick wars. I thought I might speak to that for just a minute. And I'm not sure I'll have time, but later on, Donald Trump said a lot of things, and he says his poll numbers would be higher if not for the Mueller's witch hunt. Some people say Trump's poll numbers would be higher if Trump would stop tweeting, but we may not get to that. We'll see if we can right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Kaporos literally means atonement and has been a religious tradition of Orthodox Jews for over 2,000 years. On the eve of Yom Kippur, some Orthodox Jews will recite scripture and then swing a live chicken over their head while reciting a prayer like, "This is my substitute, this is my exchange, this is my atonement. This fowl will go to death, and I will enter upon a good and long life." The chicken is then butchered in the kosher fashion, and the meat of the chicken is then often donated to those in need of food. The ceremony invites the participants to contemplate their own mortality and appreciate the atonement of their sins. The Alliance to End Chicken as Kaporos does not like this practice. They sued the Jewish community in New York City, arguing that the practice violated sanitation and public nuisance laws. The Manhattan judge presiding over the case wasn't buying it. Judge Deborah James concluded that there was insufficient evidence to demonstrate that Kaporos was a public nuisance, and she refused to judicially stop the 2,000-year religious tradition. The Alliance to End Chickens as Kaporos may not like it, but the First Amendment is a high bar protecting even peaceful minority religious rituals involving chickens. That bar should not be lowered unless there is a clear, compelling reason to do so. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, I might just mention a number of you have left some comments, and so you can go to our Facebook page and find those. Some say this makes them ill. They're upset about that. Mark Downey reminds us of something I wanted to get to, and I appreciate him bringing that up, and that is there is another connection between the Kavanaugh family and the individual that is actually making these allegations, because when we talk about this, Christine Blasey Ford, you have to go back to the Blaseys and recognize that at one point, Martha Kavanaugh, who is, again, known as a judge, who is the mother of Brett Kavanaugh, actually was involved in a very important issue as well. The Christina Ford's parents were defendants in a 1996 foreclosure case, and that was actually presided over by Martha Kavanaugh. Now, is there anything to that? Well, some people are saying, yes, this is maybe retaliation for that, but nevertheless, just a reminder that as we get into this particular situation, we find out a little bit more that is now being covered and reported. And so, again, to give credit to some of the mainstream media, they've covered some of that, but it's amazing how much still is yet to be determined. And maybe that tells us something, maybe it doesn't, but I just thought I'd put that on the table there as well. Just before we wind down for this morning in the first hour, I did want to get to another commentary that came out about the issue of Nike and Colin Kaepernick. And again, it's by our good friend David French, in which he says that what you're starting to see today in this highly politicized age is that, he says, multiple major corporations have stripped away any pretense of neutrality and now openly on the progressive side of American political debates. And we've seen that in terms of some of these individuals that graduate from liberal schools, go into the business world. Oftentimes, if they were very liberal, they would go into the academy, go into law, but many of them are going into those corporations and find out that they can be very liberal, very progressive, and actually pay no price for their progressive activism. And a good example of that is Nike. Days after it was announced that a multi-million-dollar deal with Colin Kaepernick was controversial, prompting, as we reported here, a stock dip at the time and a torrent of stories dealing how this was foolish to alienate their customer base, its stock gained back all of the losses and reported that its sales actually had skyrocketed in the days after launching the campaign. So it shows, again, that many individuals who have kind of a liberal agenda in their corporations are convinced that they can be as blatant about their liberal, leftist, progressive ideas and not be harmed in the workplace. And that is certainly being the case in the fact that they're not being harmed in the marketplace. Now, one of the things that David French does, which I think is very good, is he said, if you think carefully and systematically about America's cultural and economic realities, you really shouldn't be surprised that Nike could survive and even thrive in the midst of this kind of political storm of its own creation. For example, he says, if you're reading this piece right now, and again, it's on our website, so you can read it in its entirety, you're already among the most politically engaged citizens in the nation. And by the way, if you're a listener to Point of View, you're probably also politically engaged as well. So as you read this, ask yourself this question. How many of you have bought a less attractive shoe, avoided a good movie, or even chosen on a less user-friendly web browser because you wanted to send a political message? And he said, if you've engaged in such a boycott, are you confident that there are more Americans who've done the same than there are boycotters? Because you have boycotters and you have boycotters. And the bottom line is as much as I dislike some of the things that I got a feeling Nike's going to do in my face, the bottom line is I still went walking this morning and this weekend in Nike shoes and have a second pair that I'm about ready to put on because I've worn out the other one. And so when I go walking or running, probably still going to have Nike material and apparel on, and I think that is so typical of what is happening. Okay, so one more question in your head. But didn't we actually say that because the NFL and ESPN and some of them were getting so political that people were actually tuning in the NFL games less? The reality is, I don't watch them that much, but, am I typical? And does that change my philosophy at all? Well, again, this is where you get kind of a mea culpa from David French, because he said last year a J.D. Power survey of over 9,000 fans indicated that the Kaepernick-led national anthem protests were the top reason why fans reported they watched fewer games the previous season. In response, he said, I wrote a piece called Politicized Sports Pay the Price. But then, as we received more information about more sports, the picture grew considerably more cloudy. It turns out that major sports that have shunned politics have also faced ratings and attendance declines. College football, perhaps Red America's most beloved sport, experienced rating declines across multiple networks. Attendance at Major League Baseball games is its lowest level in 15 years, and even the Olympic ratings are falling. Yeah, and yes, he says there are individual exceptions. Put the Cubs in position to win their first World Series in a century, and more people watch. A thrilling college football playoff can draw more eyeballs, especially when no games are scheduled on New Year's Eve. But the only major sports league that's showing a real and broad increase in viewers just so happens to be the most political. That's the NBA. And, of course, part of that has to do with the fact that the NBA really plays a lot to Blue America. So whether it's the Greg Popovich rants or LeBron James political stands, that's the case. But nevertheless, the point is that he is making, and it's worth acknowledging, is that even though it seemed for a short period of time like the Colin Kaepernick decision by Nike was a disaster, turns out that maybe they've done pretty well after all. So I thought I'd post that, if for no other reason, to maybe modify some of the things that we've posted in the past, and to recognize that even though people may be really upset about something that a particular sports figure says or a particular artist will say, in many cases we tend to be a pretty forgiving people, and it has to be pretty significant. It has to really be in your face. It has to be pretty egregious for anybody at all to say, you know what, I'm just not going to go there any longer. I still haven't made it into a Target store, but that's the exception, I suspect, rather than the rule. Real quick, let me just mention that the president tweeted on Saturday that his approval ratings, which had hovered below 50% for weeks, are down simply because of the ties to Russia and the Mueller witch hunt. But probably a better explanation comes from Daniel Henniger. If the president really wants to help himself, and more importantly, wants to help some other Republicans running for office, he would do himself well to actually stop some of the tweets that just simply don't help him at all. And one of the reasons that sometimes the mainstream press is not covering the remarkable economic news. In the last 6 months between December and our summer vacation, the U.S. economy achieved full employment. We now have a labor shortage. Unemployment rates for blacks and Hispanics are at historic lows. After 8 years of suppression, a still powerful U.S. economy is been liberated. So he comes and says, you know, why should Mr. Trump's media opposition waste time covering an economic boom when they've got the clickbait of a president repeatedly tweet mocking his own attorney general, publicizing the Mueller witch hunt, fighting with fixer lawyer Michael Cohen, and fiddling with the height of the White House flag after John McCain died. That, Mr. President, may be the reason that the press hasn't covered your economic news, because you give them so many other things to talk about instead. Let's take a break. When we come back, we will get into the subject of shame and maybe even learn a little bit more about how that could relate to the conversation we've been having. All that coming up right after these important messages.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. I hope you had a great weekend. We're going to be getting into a book interview in just a minute, but let me just mention that this week promises to be full of fireworks at the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that is, some people have even said that the confirmation hearings now for Judge Brett Kavanaugh might make the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings look civil. I don't know about that, but for those of you that remember back in the 1990s, all of the allegations of Anita Hill against Clarence Thomas and the uproar there have now exploded because of Christine Blasey Ford, who is a psychologist at Palo Alto University in Northern California, who is the person who has come forward saying, I am the individual that Brett Kavanaugh, when he was in high school, actually groped. And so we'll get into some of that a little bit later. I might mention we've posted a couple of articles, one which is entitled, What's in It for Republicans? And that is there any value in continuing to defend Brett Kavanaugh and what the Republicans might do if indeed he steps down, which I think is highly unlikely now, because both Brett Kavanaugh and Christine Ford have said they are willing to come before the Senate Judiciary Committee to testify. So this will be something we'll be following later in the week. And in light of those allegations, one of the other articles I've posted here, which we'll get to a little bit later, by David French, weighing the allegations against Brett Kavanaugh. When you have these kinds of claims that are made and an individual says they did not take place, then you have to kind of go in to evaluate other individuals and other claims and allegations and which makes most sense. And so we're going to get into that a little bit later. But those are some articles that I would point to that I think will give you a better understanding of what is going to be, I think, an ongoing series of discussions and debates that will take place all week here on Point of View. But let me, if I can, get to the book interview that we had regularly scheduled, and then we'll get into some of those issues a little bit later in the program. And that is to bring to the microphone Dr. Mark Baker. If you are familiar with him, perhaps you are familiar with his book, Jesus, the Greatest Therapist Who Ever Lived. His newest book is Overcoming Shame, Let Go of Others' Expectations and Embrace God's Acceptance. It is published by Harvest House. It should be a book that you should be able to find in your local bookstore, but we have a link to his website and also a link where you can get it either in paperback or on Kindle. He is an individual that has a Ph.D. in clinical psychology, a master's degree in theology, serves as the executive director of the Vie Counseling Centers in Pasadena and Santa Monica, California. Dr. Baker, welcome to Point of View today.
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate being part of your good work there.
I want to spend some time, obviously, focusing on your book, but for just a minute, you have dealt with people that have had feelings of guilt and shame and all sorts of things. But let's look at shame for just a minute. I've had some people say, well, you know, Christina Ford actually said this happened in the 1980s, but didn't actually speak about it until 2012. But isn't it true that some individuals that have been through a traumatic experience and feel that shame will oftentimes wait even decades before they actually say something about it?
It is true. I mean, that does happen. We'll have people who have gone through humiliating circumstances and they don't tell anybody about it for years until something will happen that'll make them want to come forward and speak about it. So yes, that does happen. And I do think, actually, one major reason why all of us do bad things is through unresolved feelings of shame that, we'll talk about in a minute. And I also, though, think in sort of this circumstance, if you're going to go all the way back to high school or even college age, there's a lot of acting out that goes on in those ages that is alcohol-related, that ends up becoming a bad behavior that's just a result of immature judgment, and those things people kind of go underground with for the rest of their lives. That people don't talk about stuff that they've done in high school and college because it's a time period where they're getting away from their parents' authority and acting out in ways that are foolish and immature in their judgment, and they just sort of file that away. And sometimes I have had people who come to therapy later in life and say like their 30s, and we start delving into things when there's stuff that happened to them in high school and college or things they did in high school and college that they literally have not thought about until we go back and start looking at their past. So, yes, that is something that can happen. I don't want to say that it doesn't happen because sometimes it does.
Yeah, sure. And again, we'll get into this a little bit later because one of the things David French brings out is, we don't have any contemporaneous corroboration. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it's, again, I want to try to be fair on both sides of this issue. Yep. And over the next 24, 48 hours, we're going to learn a lot more. But let's learn, if we can, from your book. And one of the things that I really appreciate you is it wasn't until I got to about the second chapter and I thought, this is why I'm so glad you wrote the book. And that is, you said there's so much confusion about shame. We've talked about this before. Some people say it's innate. Some people say it's developed. Some people say it is learned over a development. Others say that it is there's no support of healthy benefits. Others say it's unhealthy. Sort us through for just a minute. I know one of the reasons you wrote the book is you are in a profession where there's so much misinformation about shame. That alone is worth the price of the book, I'd say.
You're right. It's very confusing. We use the words interchangeably. We say shame and guilt as if they're the same thing. People say, I'm ashamed of something when really they feel guilty. And it goes all the way back. Psychology is still a very new science. We're about where physics was when Newton got hit on the head with the apple. We're about 100 years old, and so we make a lot of mistakes. Freud was wrong. When it came to guilt and shame, he wrote a lot about guilt when actually now we know he was talking about shame. So people get them confused. Psychologists have gotten them confused. Some psychologists don't mention it at all in their theories. Others say it's the most important emotion for you to understand dysfunctional behavior. So I apologize for all of psychology. I don't apologize up front here. We have been confusing, and we're just now sorting this out because we're doing actually good research on these subjects. So let me say this. Guilt is about what you do. Shame is about who you are. That's the basic distinction that we need to make up front. I feel bad when I have done something wrong and I've hurt other people, and guilt is a healthy emotion that makes me want to go and make things right. So guilt is a good thing. The Bible talks about healthy guilt. There's a godly sorrow that leads to repentance. You'd be a sociopath if you didn't have it. So guilt itself is not a problem. Now, shame, on the other hand, shame is the belief there's something defective about you.
Right.
That you personally are worthless and you're not worthy of love. That's the key thing. This makes you want to hide. You don't want to go and talk to the other person. You hope they never bring it up again. As you can see, then that really leads to other problems because you don't get things fixed. So shame really is about yourself as a person, your lack of worth. Guilt is about things you do that you need to repent for or make amends for or make things right. Now, of course, you can mix the two, and then it gets really confusing.
Sure. Let me take a break, and we'll come back and sort some of that out because, again, this book, 200 pages, deals with issues like vulnerability and humility and self-esteem and narcissism. We've got a lot to cover. We'll do our best as we talk with Dr. Mark Baker, and we'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Later this week, the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee vote on the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh. We may be treated to more of the antics that took place during the confirmation hearings. If so, that will provide yet one more reason why the Senate leadership should get rid of the confirmation hearings. Even when there aren't all the theatrics, the confirmation hearings aren't very helpful. This time you had Democrats ask Judge Kavanaugh essentially the same questions over and over about abortion and guns. He wasn't going to give conclusive answers no matter how many times you repeated the question. All of that goes back to what some have called the Ginsburg rule established by Senator Joseph Biden back when Ruth Bader Ginsburg appeared before the committee. Republicans and Democrats can debate whether the so-called rule should apply, but we all know that the nominee isn't going to answer specific questions. And it's worth noting that most of the senators asking questions already made up their minds, even though that didn't stop many of them from complaining that they only had 500,000 documents. Another obvious reason for ending these hearings is the fact that they have been the occasion for lots of political grandstanding. Senators Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and Richard Blumenthal provided numerous examples of political posturing and media manipulation. But it was more than just the interruptions and motions to adjourn. Once the hearings got underway, we had to listen to speeches by each and every member of the committee. Very few were even worth remembering. Most were forgettable and irritating. Finally, we need to acknowledge that the confirmation hearings have become a circus, with apologies to people who work in a circus. On the first day of the hearing, 70 were arrested. It didn't get much better the rest of the week, and outside you had people dressed in costumes yelling and screaming. I'm ready to eliminate these Senate hearings, and I suspect many Americans agree with me. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Universal 1440, Unbroken, Path to Redemption, the rest of World War II hero Louis Zamperini's true story, now playing, rated PG-13.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Mark Baker, and again, his book is entitled Overcoming Shame, Let Go of Others' Expectations and Embrace God's Acceptance. Many of you in the California area might even be able to go to his counseling center, but let me just also mention that I've had a chance to watch him on various YouTube videos, so you can benefit from that, and of course benefit from this book, about 200 pages, really getting into all sorts of aspects related to shame in terms of our self-esteem and issues of envy and jealousy, the importance of forgiveness, narcissism. It's really very complete. But you were mentioning that even though we want to say that guilt is kind of the bad feelings you have when you've gone too far, shame is kind of the feeling you get for not going far enough, or put it another way, guilt has to do with what you do and shame has to do with who you are. But those get mixed together pretty quickly, don't they, as you were mentioning?
They do. A common problem I have is, say, after people get a divorce, they come to my office, and if I'm meeting with a guy, he'll say things like, oh, you know, I should have bought her that house. I shouldn't have spent so much time at work. You know, I was so focused on the finances, I shouldn't have done that. That sounds like guilt, because he's going over these things he should have done, like I didn't do this and I should have done that. But the truth is, when you dig deep in it, it's really shame masquerading as guilt, that we'll talk about the things we should have done really because we're afraid that we weren't enough of a man to get it done. Because, you see, if she didn't leave you for what you did, then she left you for who you are, and that's much, much worse. So oftentimes in divorce, and it can happen in many other circumstances too, But in divorce, people end up walking away with profound feelings of shame, feeling like I was inadequate as a man or I was inadequate as a woman, and that's the reason they left me. They left me because I wasn't enough. And then that's so intolerable for any of us that we try to defend against it by talking about all the things we should have done or the things that we shouldn't have done. And then we get confused, and people can spin around feeling guilty for years and never resolve that because they don't realize it isn't about your guilt, it's about your shame. You're afraid that you're an inadequate person yourself, and you got to deal with that feeling in order to stop this guilt that goes on and on and on. And we've all got some relative or some friend who just is guilty about everything. And that's
false guilt.
Exactly, it's false guilt. Exactly, it's false guilt, not true guilt. True guilt that leads to repentance and restored relationships, and there's false guilt based on fear that's got shame mixed in with it. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't solve anything. So it is very important to sort that out, especially for the people who just can't seem to get rid of the guilt that won't go away because they've got an underlying shame problem that they're not addressing.
And again, the book is entitled Overcoming Shame. Again, information about it on our website. You can order it there. Of course, it's published by Harvest House. I'm sure you'll be able to find it in your local bookstore. Also have a link to Vie Counseling Center.org. You don't even have to know how to spell it because we have a link there as well. And one of your chapters deals with vulnerability, and one of the most popular TED Talks, and I'm a TED Talk junkie, I love all the TED Talks, is the one on the power of vulnerability. And let's talk about that for just a minute, because in the midst of this, sometimes people are afraid that they're not supposed to be vulnerable. They're supposed to stuff it down. You've got, of course, for men, the idea that I'm supposed to be independent and a leader and those kinds of things. Talk about how vulnerability is a key to some of these issues.
It's absolutely critical. You know, Brene Brown really has her finger on the pulse in that whole subject of vulnerability. You're right. She did the second most watched TED Talk of all time, and she has 3 New York Times bestsellers based on the subject of vulnerability. So she's really hitting a chord with people in our country that in order to heal shame, you have to be able to be vulnerable, and we fight against that. And her research shows, and my study shows the same, that everybody admires vulnerability when you see other people do it, but nobody wants to do it themselves, right?
Yeah.
It's like, it's fine for you, good on you that you're willing to be vulnerable, but I'm not going to go there. And yet it is the thing that we have to do in order to heal ourselves of these deeper underlying shame issues that I was talking about. And you're absolutely right. We confuse vulnerability with weakness, because there's financial vulnerability and military vulnerability and physical vulnerability, and all those things are weaknesses. But psychologically, in this one area, and spiritually, to be vulnerable is the strongest way for you to live. We now know that the people who are most influential are the people who have what we call emotional intelligence, and those people are not just smart intellectually; they're smart emotionally. And they're able to be vulnerable with their feelings in a way that's most powerful in leading other people. And Jesus is probably the best example we have in history of someone who was humble, he was vulnerable, he washed the disciples' feet. It was a metaphor for all of us that if you want to have a powerful relationship with other people, you've got to be vulnerable to them. And we don't get this in our psychology today. We don't get that. That's the most powerful way to lead other people and the most powerful way to heal the deepest issues with shame in our life that most of us have trouble even acknowledging exist, especially for us as men.
Yes.
You know, we were raised to not talk about our feelings, and we actually have fewer neurons in the part of the brain that expresses feelings than women do. So we are physically not as well equipped to be vulnerable emotionally as women are, and we have to fight against it. Our generation is the first generation to really fight against that and say, no, it's a sign of strength to be a man who talks about his feelings, not a sign of a weakness.
Well said. And again, that's in the chapter on vulnerability. You also mentioned in passing when you were talking about Jesus, the issue of humility. And again, I love the title, Humility Has Nothing to Do with Humiliation. And there is a distinction between, again, sometimes people talk about healthy shame and unhealthy shame, or the idea that I feel worthless, which I think sometimes we all do because of something that doesn't work, and I am worthless.
Right.
Take us through that, if you might.
Yeah, that's a really important. It's a little bit complicated technically when I try to explain it, but it's a really important thing to get your mind around. See, the mind works outside of your conscious awareness most of the time. 10% of your mind is operating consciously. You're aware of it. 90% of it's operating in the background. It's the part that comes out in your dreams, the part that really the most creative part of you is outside of our awareness. And if you experience shame over and over and over again, you eventually develop the unconscious, outside of your awareness belief that you are not worthy of love, that you're defective, there's something wrong with you. And the problem with having a belief that's in your unconscious or outside of your awareness, you experience it as a fact. You don't just feel worthless. You are worthless when you have this belief outside of your conscious awareness. And we have to really work at digging around in that area of the mind that's not right in front of us, those thoughts that we're thinking that are just right outside of our awareness. We all have that moment in the shower when you go, oh, right, yeah, I hadn't thought about that in a while. That awareness of that part of your mind that's operating outside of your awareness, to pull that into conscious view and to realize, oh, wow, I started feeling bad about myself back when I was a kid, and I've carried that with me to this day. That thing that happened to me, or those things that happened to me, developed this feeling and then this belief that I'm, in fact, don't deserve to be loved. And it is very hard for us to admit that. And again, as men, it's hard for us to admit our feelings. I have guys who tell me, oh, I don't have an issue with shame. I'm not aware of feeling shame. And then I ask them, well, have you ever been shamed? And they're all, well, yeah, that's happened to me. My dad did this. My mom did that. That's the roots of it. We just have a hard time admitting it, that we've got these feelings of insecurity and doubts about our self-worth that are pushed out of our conscious awareness into that part of the brain that does the most damage. And believe me, the unconscious always wins. If you've got doubts about yourself that are outside of your awareness, those will come out in your behavior. Those are the things that make us do the things that we regret. And so it's very important for us to dig into this area. And to go back to the humility subject, that's a really important one because it requires great humility for us to admit, okay, maybe I do have some painful feelings about myself that I haven't acknowledged to anyone. And that's the beginning of the road to healing, where you start to acknowledge that you don't know everything about yourself. Guys say that to me. Say, I think I know myself pretty well. Nobody knows themselves completely. And you have to have the humility to say, I know myself pretty well, but there's always something else I could learn. That's a guy who's going to be a more powerful person in his relationships with other people.
Well said. Let me take a break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation with Dr. Mark Baker. And if you'd like to join us, I think this is probably one where you want to just sit back, take some notes, and get the book and get some information. But if you have a specific question, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. The book is entitled Overcoming Shame, about 200 pages, Let Go of Others' Expectations and Embrace God's Acceptance, published by Harvest House. And we've covered just a few of the chapters, but we're going to get back into what about self-esteem and resentment, narcissism. We've talked about this before, and most importantly, I think we've been giving you some tools to overcome shame, but we'll end with some comments about that as well. All that coming up right after these important messages. Stay tuned.
From Universal 1440 comes Unbroken, Path to Redemption, based on the best-selling book telling the rest of the true story of Olympian and World War II hero Louis Zamperini.
Tonight, there's a drowning man just looking for some type of hope for the future. But there's a lifeline. Just reach out.
Unbroken, Path to Redemption, rated PG-13, may be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at unbrokenfilm.com.
You don't become an Olympian without investing all you've got. You don't become a war hero without putting it all on the line. Those who leave a mark on this world demonstrate they believe in something greater than themselves, a purpose, a cause. In a time of fake news, the need for solid information is perhaps greater than ever. Bring truth to the nation by joining the Truth Team at Point of View. Our cause needs heroes like you. Demonstrate what you believe. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Dr. Mark Baker with us. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know more about the book, it is now out, Overcoming Shame, Letting Go of Others' Expectations and Embracing God's Acceptance. It is a book that I think you will find very helpful if you're dealing with this issue, or maybe as we get into this, you realize, I guess I am thinking about these topics and didn't even realize it. And before we go any further, Dr. Baker, let's talk about your website. We have a link to Vie Counseling Centers. And as I've said before, some of our listeners in California certainly could attend there. But there are others that will certainly benefit by going to your YouTube videos, finding some of the books that you have written about, including Jesus, the Greatest Therapist Who Ever Lived, and Spiritual Wisdom for a Happy Life, and, of course, this one, Overcoming Shame. But as people go to the website, what is available for each one of our listeners?
Well, they can go to the website of our counseling center. I've got 40 therapists that work for me in Los Angeles. It's called the Vie Counseling Centers. And we've got lots of resources there, too, things that they could read and benefit from. And they can go to drmarkbaker.com, which is also linked to the Vie Counseling Center.
Sure.
And I've got lots of videos there, lots of recordings, audio tapes, videotapes, dozens there on all kinds of different subjects. I also have, as you've mentioned, my YouTube series. I've also got dozens of YouTube videos that are free. They're up on YouTube of all subjects related to all my books. So marital conflict, depression, anxiety, communication, self-esteem. We deal with all those subjects, both from a spiritual and psychological perspective. My PhD is in psychology, but I also have a master's in theology. So I like to blend those two things together to help people live a whole life together. And many people see the YouTube videos or go to my website and download some of the audio lectures there to get some advice on how to deal with their emotional and spiritual lives. And then also they come to our counseling centers here in the Los Angeles area too, where we can sit down with them face to face. So we're in the business of helping other people live functional, healthy lives, and I've been doing it since 1980, so long time.
Well, again, I might just mention, as I did before, and you just mentioned again, that you have a master's degree in theology as well as a PhD in clinical psychology. This is important because you really are looking at this from a biblical point of view, a biblical lens. And this is important because oftentimes, and I don't mean to be overly critical, but I've met some that have kind of the biblical side, but maybe don't understand the counseling side. And believe me, over the years, I've sometimes in various groups have spoken to counselors who at best have a Sunday school understanding of theology. And you really have tried to bring the two together in a way that I think is admirable.
That's absolutely true. Both sides are guilty of this. I have talked to Christian counselors who are well-meaning, but they're really not psychologically educated, and that really limits their effectiveness. And, of course, it's even worse on the other side. There are many, many therapists who are actually hostile towards Christianity, and that limits their effectiveness because they're not treating the whole person. And so there are both sides to this, people who are extremes in both directions. What I've come to find over the years is that people who take extreme stances are doing that out of fear. You know, if you're afraid that there's something about the Bible or Christianity that's not good, then you're not going to really honestly take an honest look at it. And the same thing's true the other way around. I've met people in the church, well-meaning people who are afraid that secular psychology is scary, and because some psychologists are hostile towards Christianity, they got there fairly, to that position that we need to not listen to them. Well, we don't need to be afraid of them. All truth's God's truth. And if you are honestly studying with integrity both theology and psychology, you're going to come to a very helpful blend of how to help people live whole lives. And that's what we do at our counseling center. Everyone here has both theological as well as psychological training, and we're helping put people's lives together in a difficult time. This is really a difficult time for us.
I would think so.
Spiritually.
I understand that. Let's we can talk about some of those difficulties because there are these dark emotions, and you have chapters on resentment, chapters on envy and jealousy. I've watched some of your YouTube videos, and you just say, if nothing else, get off this resentment. Forgive people because, if nothing else, just because of the harm it does to you. Talk about the negative, toxic emotions like resentment and envy and jealousy and things like that, and what that does to an individual.
Yeah, it's really important to understand this. Take resentment. It's really important to understand that. And I know good people who hang on to resentments for decades. You know, it's you've heard it. You know, they're drinking poison and expecting it to kill the other person.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work that way. Resentment is extremely damaging to you. People who have chronic feelings of resentment towards another person literally are attacking their own organs in their own body. It is unhealthy. And what we understand now, and this is just right out of the Bible, but what we understand now is resentment is a problem you've got with yourself, not the other person. Now, here's how resentment works. We don't resent earthquakes or tornadoes. We resent people. And the reason is because resentment is the result of feeling demeaned by another person. If someone demeans your value in some way, you resent that person. That's where it comes from. Now, this is the real key. The reason I resent someone is because something inside of me begins to doubt my own self-worth because of what they did to me. So then in my secret of heart of hearts down inside, I go, oh, wow, maybe I am not great. Maybe I am at fault in some way. But I don't want to admit that. So what I do is, well, then they got to pay. Well, this person, they can't get away with that. And so I go on this big crusade to devalue the other person or put them down or see them taken down. And I'm talking about Bible-believing Christians who'll do this. You know, where they'll find some way to justify their attacks and gossip and undermining of the other person. I've seen pastors do this to other pastors.
Oh, yeah.
They begin to doubt their own self-worth, so they've got to vilify the other person. And they'll come up with, you know, spiritual language that's really rooted in resentment, you know, resentment towards another person. And it's only when you're able to realize, okay, wait a minute, the heart of my resentment of this person is that I have felt demeaned, and that has lowered my own feelings of worth in my own mind. The real issue is here, you've made me doubt my own worth, and so I need to hide from that and make you pay. And once we get that out, then we realize the brilliance in the statement when Jesus said, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eyes and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? He got it. He said, why are you complaining about the other person? Because the real root of the problem is in you, is inside you. And what I help people do is when they're trapped in resentment towards the other person, help them realize that, you know where the root of this is that you begin to doubt your own self, your own value, your own worth, because they demeaned you. And in some way in your heart you've agreed with that, and that's why you're so mad at them. You can't let them get away with that because they've caused you to doubt yourself. And once they're able to see that, then releasing that resentment becomes much, much easier. It's like, wow, you know, that's why I still hate that person after all these years. And I've done some work at a prison in Louisiana, and what I've discovered there is that there are people who feel so angry at the perpetrators there, at the men who've been incarcerated. They resent them because of how demeaned they feel, the loved one they've lost, and the insult they feel that is the result of their crime, that even after that person is executed, they still resent them.
Yes.
So who's living in the prison now, right? They still carry these resentments and don't know why. They can't understand that the root of it is the doubt of their own value that's been caused by being demeaned by another person. So that's a really important emotion for us to get a handle on.
Yeah.
It eats us up from the inside.
I might just mention, too, that one of the things I appreciate about your book is you quote from the, of course, prison in Angola, Louisiana, the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Of course, we've had a number of guests here that have ministered in there. I've even had the warden, Burl Cale, that you mentioned in there, Burl Kane, I should say, Burl Kane. Yep. I said it wrong. Kane, right? In this studio as well, because we just think so highly of what has happened in that particular prison. And again, if you think about people that can't practice forgiveness on both sides of that, those on some side of that iron gate and on that one side of those walls and on the other side of the wall as well. And just an incredible ministry that's there. So let me take a break, and when we come back, real quickly, might want to get your comments at least a little bit about narcissism, and then most importantly, the chapters that deal with overcoming shame. But we have to take one of those mandatory breaks. And Dr. Mark Baker with us. This book is entitled Overcoming Shame, Let Go of Others' Expectations and Embrace God's Acceptance. It is published by Harvest House. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to Vie Counseling Centers, and that will also put you in contact with drmarkbaker.com. So we have two different ways in which you can connect up with him. And, of course, there's even an 800 number if you wanted to talk to one of the counselors. But most importantly, we want to put some of these resources in your hands so that you can live the life that God has called you to live. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Kaporos literally means atonement and has been a religious tradition of Orthodox Jews for over 2,000 years. On the eve of Yom Kippur, some Orthodox Jews will recite scripture and then swing a live chicken over their head while reciting a prayer like, "This is my substitute, this is my exchange, this is my atonement. This fowl will go to death, and I will enter upon a good and long life." The chicken is then butchered in the kosher fashion, and the meat of the chicken is then often donated to those in need of food. The ceremony invites the participants to contemplate their own mortality and appreciate the atonement of their sins. The Alliance to End Chicken as Kaporos does not like this practice. They sued the Jewish community in New York City, arguing that the practice violated sanitation and public nuisance laws. The Manhattan judge presiding over the case wasn't buying it. Judge Deborah James concluded that there was insufficient evidence to demonstrate that Kaporos was a public nuisance, and she refused to judicially stop the 2,000-year religious tradition. The Alliance to End Chickens as Kaporos may not like it, but the First Amendment is a high bar protecting even peaceful minority religious rituals involving chickens. That bar should not be lowered unless there is a clear, compelling reason to do so. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Mark Baker with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Overcoming Shame. Next hour, we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. We'll also be talking with our friend Christian Overman, but also talk about the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings and some of the testimony that will take place, no doubt, later this week. So we'll get into all of that. But just before we run out of time, I wanted to talk about the secret cause of narcissism. And really, there's almost a whole book that could be written there. And as an individual that I interview a lot of people in politics. I don't know what it is, but politicians tend to be narcissists, including presidents, some business executives, and even some of these ministers do. You've, I think, really helped us understand that phenomenon. Can you explain it?
Yes, it's just important for us to grasp because it is, it's all around us today. Yes, narcissism, you might think we wouldn't really want to put a chapter on narcissism in a book on shame because aren't they shameless? You know, these people have no shame. Isn't that the issue? Well, what we now know psychologically is that the root cause of narcissism is shame. that ironically, the people who are most arrogant, the people who need to draw all the attention to themselves, are not confident. They're arrogant, and that arrogance is rooted in shame. Is rooted in really doubts about their own worth. Now, that is hard to get to because the extreme forms of narcissism are so loud and noisy. We call it defensive grandiosity, that they rarely slow down enough for them to even realize that they have these feelings of self-doubt. But if you can get to the deeper causes underneath that, the deeper feelings that they feel, if you get them to be vulnerable, you can find out there's an emptiness there, and then there's, under that arrogance, are feelings of doubt and self-worth. And you know the difference really when you're in their presence. When you're in the presence of someone who's truly confident, you feel good about yourself. You feel like, wow, I learned something, or wow, that person really has strengths, and wow, I feel like I benefit from my relationship with them. But when you're in the presence of someone who's arrogant, which is narcissistic, you don't feel good. They suck the air out of the room. They have to draw all the attention onto themselves. They're not really interested in you and your concerns. They want you to be interested in them and their concerns. It's one way. Now, confidence that masquerades as narcissism is really a problem. And we used to think, well, it's a personality disorder. And originally, psychologists couldn't even treat it, because they wouldn't come to therapy and they wouldn't admit they have problems, right? But now we see it as on a continuum. You can be a little bit narcissistic, or you can be a lot narcissistic, because we're all selfish to some degree. We all want to draw the attention to ourselves to some degree. It's the problem with the human condition. So we now see narcissism as really on a continuum, because we all kind of like attention a little bit, and we all are concerned about our own needs a little bit, and then there are people who are on the extreme, and it blocks their empathy, it blocks their ability to be sensitive to the needs of others, and they just want the attention all to themselves. And that's when it becomes pathological, when you're out there on the extreme.
Right.
And it's interesting that you mentioned Burl Cain. I just signed a contract with Fortress Press to write a book on his life. So I'm going to be writing a book about the prison at Angola, because I went there and spent many weeks there looking at the selfishness of the inmates there. The people there are serving life sentences because they've done horrible, selfish, narcissistic acts to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found is Burl Cain was able to bring about tremendous healing in the lives of many, hundreds of these guys, hundreds. And they've been genuinely transformed. He put a seminary in the middle of the prison and started educating these guys, and they have been genuinely changed. I've talked to several men who were determined to be so narcissistic, so pathologically sociopathic that we had to lock them away for life. And I've talked to men who've been completely transformed, and I saw how what we thought was something that's incurable, antisocial personality disorder, was really the result of all kinds of trauma and injury in their lives, that if you were to treat them in the right way, these people can be healed. Some of them. Now, I have to say some, because, and Burl Cain will tell you this, there are those he calls predators who don't want to be helped, and so they never change. And that's always true. We have free will, and there are those who are so sociopathic that they don't. But for the vast majority of these people, narcissism can be healed with the courage to face your shame and the vulnerability to admit it, and to seek out the kind of healing relationships that are there to change it. I've seen it happen. I've seen narcissism cured in the scariest of people, too. Really.
That's incredible. And I might just mention you have a section there on narcissism and criminal behavior. Criminals are selfish. But just before, we're almost out of time here, you talked about healing shame, and I like that, because in your book you say, I don't like the word cure because it implies being free of symptoms. Yet there is healing, and this comes from a renewal of our mind by the healing effect of salvation. In about 2 minutes, can you kind of give us a brief summary of really what the theme of the book is, of overcoming shame?
It is, yes. I don't like the word cure, because we all have to admit that we're going to be dealing with some effects of shame our whole life. We're going to have self-doubt. We're going to have moments when we feel less than other people, and that's just the human condition. And in this life, we will deal with those feelings. They'll come and go. If they're transitory, it just requires our ability to face up to those feelings and deal with them. But for the people who have chronic shame that's gone on and on and on, and become what I call shame-prone, there's healing for that too, and it requires three things. It requires the courage to admit that you feel shame, the vulnerability to confess it to God and others, and then the experience of grace, which it means psychologically acceptance. Now, you've got to have courage just to slow down and say, okay, yeah, all right, you're right, I do have feelings of shame. Vulnerability to be able to speak it out loud to God or others, and then you must experience grace. Now, Brene Brown, as we talked about, has done a great job of pointing out the importance of vulnerability. But if you're vulnerable with the wrong person, it's not going to do you any good at all. As a matter of fact, it'll backfire. If you're vulnerable with people who take advantage of you and who are not gracious, who are not accepting, it will hurt you. But if you are vulnerable with people who extend grace to you, as God does, when we're vulnerable to Him, He has grace for us. It heals your shame. I'm convinced that the thing that heals shame is grace. And in psychological terms, we call it acceptance. So I need to have the courage to be vulnerable and then experience the grace from God and others in order to heal that area in my life. And we can do that if we're wise. We can be the source of healing in the lives of other people when they come to us. You want to be gracious in your response. You want to be accepting in your response of other people. And you need to also find that for yourself in life. You know, I know a lot of people who've become Christians, and then they eventually kind of stopped going to church, and they stopped hanging around with other Christians. And where'd they go? They're gone. It's because they didn't continue to surround themselves with a community of grace that heals shame. And so these people fall back into their shame-based behaviors because they didn't stay in the renewing of your mind.
Very good.
It's not a once and for all thing. You've got to work on it every day of the rest of your life.
Well, again, we have a link to Vie Counseling Centers. We have a link, of course, to the book, which is Overcoming Shame, and also you can find a link to drmarkbaker.com. So if any of this information is something you'd like to get more of, it's all available at our website, Point of View. And if nothing else, Dr. Mark Baker, it's been fun to meet you, first of all, on YouTube, and now to meet you by phone. Someday I'd look forward to getting you in studio. And, of course, when you have that testimony and that biography of Burl Cain coming out, I think we should get him in studio and get you by phone. So let's see if we can do that sometime in the future.
That'd be great. I'll send you a copy as soon as it's out.
Well, again, Dr. Mark Baker with us today. The book is entitled Overcoming Shame. Let me hold it up there for you to see. Again, we have information about it on our website, pointofview.net. And if you'd like to know more about him, the Counseling Center and all of that is available at our website, pointofview.net. When we come back, Christian Overman will be with us for a few minutes. He's a founding director of the Worldview Matters, and some great material I want to pass on to you there. Then we'll finish off by talking about what are going to be incredible confirmation hearings this week for Brett Kavanaugh. It's going to remind us of the Clarence Thomas hearings. We'll be back right after this.
Go mobile with Point of View and take transformation with you on the go. Search in Google Play or the Apple Store for Point of View Radio, the Point of View Radio mobile app. Download it free today.
Good news. You are not stuck with your health care plan. Really. You have a choice, and it's a great one. It's called MediShare, and if you've heard about it and wondered what exactly it is, it's a way that people share their health care bills, and these are people who have a common faith, who want to be part of something beautiful that not only meets their health care needs, but the needs of others too. And it's people who love to save money, big time. MediShare members typically save $500 a month per family on their health care costs. That is a life changer for people. So this could be for you. Maybe it's what you've been looking for, a way to pay healthcare bills that's not only very smart financially, but it's even profound. MediShare is a nonprofit with 400,000 members nationwide who pray for and share with each other. So yes, you're not stuck. There's another way, and it could save you a lot. Find out more. Call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This is how we're going to get back into the news in just a few minutes. But first of all, we're going to talk with our good friend, Dr. Christian Overman. But just before we do so, let me just mention we've posted some articles on the website that you might want to read. And all of this has to do with what is going to be a circus, with apologies for those of you that work in a circus this week. The confirmation hearings 2 weeks ago were bad enough. This is going to be bizarre, to put it mildly, because of the accusations made by Christine Blasey Ford, claiming that indeed when they were both in high school, that then Brett Kavanaugh, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, made advances towards her, groped her, and so as a result, there is opportunity for her to testify, perhaps before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Obviously, Judge Kavanaugh wants to testify as well and has said that these allegations are false. We have posted some things I want to get to. One is what's in it for Republicans to defend him. Why not just simply have him step down? But then there are some implications for that. And then most importantly, a piece that we've posted here by David French on how to weigh the various allegations and think those through. So I'm going to get to those in just a few minutes, but let's, if we can, bring to the microphone somebody who helps us understand so often how to no longer accept this sacred secular divide, but to recognize that all that we do, every aspect of what we do, should come under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And that comes from our good friend, Dr. Christian Overman, who is the founding director of Worldview Matters. Individual who graduated from the University of Washington with 2 different degrees, has a Master of Education degree from Seattle Pacific University with an emphasis on the philosophy of Christian education, and a Doctor of Ministry degree as well with an emphasis on the theology of work. If the name sounds familiar to those of you associated with the Chuck Colson Center and some of them, of course, he is a commissioned centurion with them and has been with us before. Founded Worldview Matters back in 2000, author of such books as Assumptions That Affect Our Lives, The Lost Purpose of Learning, and God's Pleasure at Work. He and his wife Kathy live in Seattle, and we have posted one of his many blog posts on 3 essentials. So, Chris Overman, always great to have you on the program with us.
Good to be here, Kerby. Thank you very much.
You know, one of the things you start this blog post, which came out earlier this month, was the low point of my summer came when I heard about the child sexual abuse by 300-plus priests involving over 1,000 victims in Pennsylvania, reminded us, though, that the problem is not just limited to the church, but to the nation's schools, the number of school districts that have reported incidents of sexual abuse. And it was interesting because you used that to take us back in time to the fact that there was a time in which you had church members operating houses of prostitution in Geneva, and that's when the people ran the bishop out and then decided, we need to bring somebody in here. How about John Calvin to start thinking through how to apply some very key principles? So talk about that for just a minute.
Yeah, the interesting thing is actually the priests in the city that were operating houses of prostitution in Geneva, that 1500s. So it's pretty shocking, actually, but the whole city was in disrepair. The walls literally were crumbling down. It was a mess. And there was an evangelist, actually. His name is William Farel. He was from France. He came in 1531, and he began preaching and teaching and evangelizing. And he saw the great need there, and he had a good friend in France by the name of John Calvin. And he went after Calvin. He says, "Hey, John, you got to come here to Geneva. This place is in a mess. You're writing all about this theology stuff, but why don't you come here and actually put it into practice? This would be a place for you to apply what you're teaching about." And Calvin actually came. He was only 27 when he first came to Geneva. But there's an article that really has affected me on this whole story by Thomas Bloomer called Calvin and Geneva. And he points out that Calvin had three essentials to his approach to actually restoring that city or renewing it, or actually maybe reviving it for the first time. And one was to preach the gospel. He actually got back to basics here. The church of the day was in a real mess, and he understood that. So he began with the gospel of salvation, felt that people needed to make a personal commitment to Christ. And he wouldn't even serve communion to people who hadn't made that commitment. And that was not commonly practiced in those days, believe it or not. But the second thing, and this is what is very, very important, and I think we've missed out here, is that Calvin got very specific about teaching how Christianity connects to their work, their everyday work, whether they're bankers or lawyers or butchers or candlestick makers. And he was very specific. He actually spoke to the bankers about not charging more than 4% interest. And by the way, that tradition stayed in Switzerland for about 400 years. But he didn't see that Christianity was a private, personal thing. He saw that Jesus was Lord of all, and that all meant all. He owns everything. He is the Lord of everything. He's the Lord of every bank. He's also the Lord of every carpenter shop and every print shop, and you name it. His sovereignty is over all. He understood that. He says, look, how are we going to align our faith with our work? And that made a tremendous difference. In the article, it said here that Max Weber, the famous German economist, says when he was looking for the source of prosperity of the West, Weber pointed to Calvin and his teaching in Geneva. That city actually became a model, and it attracted many people to come and see what in the world is going on there. Before Calvin went to work there, the city was called the smelliest city in Europe.
Wow.
And afterwards, things began to turn around. It soon took on the reputation of a city set upon a hill. And people like John Knox came from Scotland to see what was going on there. Others came that captured what he was doing there and ultimately took it to the New World through the Puritans. And I think there's a lesson here for us.
I think so. Let's take a break. When we come back, first of all, we've posted this article called 3 Essentials, and those are preaching the gospel, teaching, and accountability. But also, if you would like to do so, this has a link to this particular piece, Calvin and Geneva, Nation-Building Missions, which I think you would want to maybe read. And when we come back, we're going to talk about how we can really emphasize work. And one of the things that more recently Christian Overman has put together is questions for contextualizing work. And that's something to talk about as well. But all in an attempt to see if we can tear down this wall, this kind of sacred secular divide. And we'll have more to say about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Later this week, the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee vote on the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh. We may be treated to more of the antics that took place during the confirmation hearings. If so, that will provide yet one more reason why the Senate leadership should get rid of the confirmation hearings. Even when there aren't all the theatrics, the confirmation hearings aren't very helpful. This time you had Democrats ask Judge Kavanaugh essentially the same questions over and over about abortion and guns. He wasn't going to give conclusive answers no matter how many times you repeated the question. All of that goes back to what some have called the Ginsburg rule established by Senator Joseph Biden back when Ruth Bader Ginsburg appeared before the committee. Republicans and Democrats can debate whether the so-called rule should apply, but we all know that the nominee isn't going to answer specific questions. And it's worth noting that most of the senators asking questions already made up their minds, even though that didn't stop many of them from complaining that they only had 500,000 documents. Another obvious reason for ending these hearings is the fact that they have been the occasion for lots of political grandstanding. Senators Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and Richard Blumenthal provided numerous examples of political posturing and media manipulation. But it was more than just the interruptions and motions to adjourn. Once the hearings got underway, we had to listen to speeches by each and every member of the committee. Very few were even worth remembering. Most were forgettable and irritating. Finally, we need to acknowledge that the confirmation hearings have become a circus, with apologies to people who work in a circus. On the first day of the hearing, 70 were arrested. It didn't get much better the rest of the week, and outside you had people dressed in costumes yelling and screaming. I'm ready to eliminate these Senate hearings, and I suspect many Americans agree with me. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Universal 1440, Unbroken, Path to Redemption, the rest of World War II hero Louis Zamperini's true story, now playing, rated PG-13.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Time for a few more minutes with Dr. Christian Overman. Again, if you would like to know more about this organization, Worldview Matters, first of all, we have a link to the website. We also have the most recent, one of the earlier blog posts. Actually, one comes out every Friday. This one came from a couple of weeks ago, but it just was so well done on 3 essentials. And so that is available. I would encourage you to sign up and subscribe so that you can receive it on a regular basis. And, of course, it also has a link to Calvin and Geneva nation-building missions. And I want to come back to this for just a minute, Chris, because when we talk about this, we are talking about a problem that began to evaporate. You know, when we talk about this idea of a Protestant work ethic, Weber sometimes even called it a Calvinistic work ethic. And part of it was the idea that there isn't the sacred secular divide that we have today, that every aspect of my life is under the lordship of Jesus Christ, and my work and my theology of work is important. And that, I think, motivates individuals to pay attention to details, to have accountability, to have respect. And those are the kinds of things that young 27-year-old John Calvin was trying to begin to inculcate there in Geneva, right?
Yes, and I think it all goes back to Genesis 1, actually. Genesis 1, 26 to 28 is commonly called the cultural mandate. I call it the first commission because we see there what God had in mind for human beings before he created the first human beings. We know what he had in mind because we are privy to this conversation of the Trinity discussing this ahead of time. And they say, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. And then he says, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, etc. What God had in mind for human beings is that we would govern over planet Earth. And it sounds kind of strange, actually, but we don't hear a lot about that. I think of Psalm 115, verse 16, the heavens, even the heavens, are the Lord's, but the earth he has given to the children of men. The Message says it this way: the heaven of heavens is for God, but he put us in charge of the earth. I do a lot of work with Christian school teachers, and I was at a conference last November and I had a breakout group, and I just stopped what I was saying. I said to this group, I asked them a question. I said, what is the purpose of education? I paused just for a second because I didn't want anyone to answer it, and I answered my own question. I said it this way. I said, the purpose of education is to equip the next generation to govern well over this material world.
Yes.
And you could have heard a pin drop. It was like somebody sucked the air out of the room. Finally, this gal near the front, she says, would you mind repeating that? And I did. I said the purpose of education is to equip the next generation to govern over this material world, to govern well over it. And then I said, has anyone ever told you that before? There was not a single hand. There must have been 25 or 35 people there. These are veteran teachers and new teachers mixed, administrators. No one had ever made that statement to them before. But it's the truth. It's why we have education. We're equipping the next generation to govern well over this material world. And I base that on that very first commission and also on Psalm 8. So we're created in the likeness and image of a working God. He worked 6 days and rested. He created us to work. He created us to work before the fall. Work is not cursed. The ground was cursed, but work was God's design. And so he created us and gave us charge over this planet. Now, that gives purpose and meaning to all kinds of work that involves governance over material things. And I'm talking about work for pay or not for pay. When I mow my lawn on the weekend, I'm governing over this little postage stamp of earth that I have responsibility for. And that is God's work. And we need to see that he's working in the earth through people. And if I can just add one more thing about Martin Luther, who really got the theology work movement going back there in the Reformation. But he was so bold to say that the milkmaid that's milking the cow to the glory of God by faith, I'm paraphrasing him, is doing as much work of God as the monk in a monastery. He really got the sacred-secular divide. He took it by the horns, and he did business with it. And part of that is the priesthood of all believers. And but over the years, it's crept back. And we are dealing with this sacred secular dualism as much today as I think, in some respects, as he was back then. We have the clergy and the laity, and we have so-called full-time Christian service. Well, isn't the plumber who's a believer supposed to be full-time Christian service too? And doesn't God care about plumbing? And we tend to think that the earth, the things of the earth are temporal, therefore they're not important. And nothing could be further from the truth. God is holding all this temporal stuff together, and there's a purpose for it. And he wants us to govern over plumbing pipes well, and electrical wires, and automobiles, and all this stuff. I love the way Chuck Colson said it. He said, on the sixth day, God created human beings and commanded them to pick up where he left off.
Good line.
A great summary of theology of work.
Might just mention that, again, we have a link to biblicalworldview.com, which is your link to Worldview Matters. And just in the few minutes we have left, let me mention that you have put together, and I'll hold it up for people watching it right now, questions for contextualizing work. just a series of questions for the God factor. Of course, we've already talked about that in terms of God's first commission in Genesis 1:26 to 28. The creation factor, which gets us into, of course, a future of new heavens and new earth. The humanity factor, as well as the moral order factor, and the purpose factor, which gets us also to the Great Commission and also just the idea of Colossians 1. So these questions you've put together, which I would recommend people actually download, print out, pass around their Sunday school class. I think this would be a good family devotion, because if we're going to turn this around and really begin to understand work from a biblical point of view, we need to really even get our kids thinking about the fact that everything they do, including their schoolwork, including their chores, including the work that mom and dad do, all needs to be done to the glory of God. So as people go to your website and they sign up for this blog post, they can get those questions, can't they, and use that in some kind of way to begin to contextualize work, can't they? Guess we lost Christian Overman, but if nothing else, we'll do our best to give you a link to the website, pointofview.net. And again, we also have a link to biblicalworldview.com. So some great resources available there. And again, I wanted to just focus a little bit of a time and attention on this today, just to give you a chance to learn about this organization and to see what is actually taking place there. Not sure if we lost Chris, but if we have, we'll simply get back to him another time. Let's move on from that, nevertheless, and somebody can tell me if we haven't, but one of the things I want to do when we come back from the break either way is to focus on what is going to be, I think, front and center for us most of the rest of this week, and that has to do with the fact that we've had the confirmation hearings. The argument was that there would be a vote later this week on maybe Thursday, September 20th, but now that could be a very significant change, we'll see, because of the allegations being made by Christine Blasey Ford, an individual who is a psychologist at Palo Alto University in Northern California, claiming that indeed she was groped by Mr. Kavanaugh when he was a student there, and so we'll get into those kinds of issues. And I've said before that this might end up being almost like a bulletproof kind of accusation to fend off, because she doesn't really recall the date. She says it was around the end of her sophomore year. She doesn't really have the exact location or who owned the house or even how she got there. So it makes it very difficult for the judge to say, well, wait a minute, I wasn't in town then, or wait a minute, I've never been to that house. And so as a result, I think that's going to be somewhat difficult for him to even fend off. But when we come back, I want to spend a little bit of time and encourage you to maybe go to the article that we've posted by David French titled Weighing the Allegations Against Brett Kavanaugh. We also have one here, What's in It for Republicans, and we'll spend some time focusing on that. And, of course, give you a chance to join our conversation. Perhaps you have some thoughts about these accusations and what that means for the judge and for the confirmation process. So we'll continue our conversation about that issue right after these important messages.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team. Pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
Good news. You are not stuck with your health care plan. Really. You have a choice, and it's a great one. It's called MediShare, and if you've heard about it and wondered what exactly it is, it's a way that people share their health care bills. And these are people who have a common faith, who want to be part of something beautiful that not only meets their healthcare needs, but the needs of others too. And it's people who love to save money, big time. MediShare members typically save $500 a month per family on their healthcare costs. That is a life changer for people. So this could be for you. Maybe it's what you've been looking for, a way to pay healthcare bills that's not only very smart financially, but it's even profound. MediShare is a nonprofit with 400,000 members nationwide who pray for and share with each other. So yes, you're not stuck. There's another way, and it could save you a lot. Find out more. Call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Last half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We are going to spend, I suspect, a lot of time over the next couple of days talking about these allegations, which again come from Christine Blasey Ford, a research psychologist at Palo Alto University. She is now that anonymous woman. We know a little bit more about her, including, as I will mention just a minute ago, the relationship between Brett Kavanaugh's mother, who actually was a judge in a case involving Christina Ford's parents. So that's another thing they'll bring to the table. But let's real quickly talk about the two articles we posted that might help you start thinking through this. And that is, of course, Senator Dianne Feinstein kind of passed through a Hail Mary pass, and the person that caught it was Dylan Matthews. He said, I honestly don't know what is in it for the Republicans to continue to back Kavanaugh. He withdraws. Trump appoints Kethledge, Hardiman, or Coney Barrett instead, and they confirm the same lame duck anyway. Plus, that way they don't have to smear a sexual assault accuser. And Charles Cook said, what's in it for Republicans, you mean, other than refusing to establish a precedent by which any nominee for anything can be vetoed by a vague, anonymous, half-peddled, whisper-driven accusations? Of course, no longer is it anonymous, but the point he's making is that if Kavanaugh withdraws right now, this will be glued to him forever. It's a little bit back to the comment that Raymond Donovan, who was in the Reagan administration, who was involved in a case where he and his firm was acquitted, said, where do I go to get my reputation back? I mean, this will now dog Brett Kavanaugh for the rest of his life. And if you don't think so, one of the things we've said is this the hearings this week may look a lot like the Clarence Thomas hearings in the 1990s. Now, I know we have younger listeners who weren't around when that happened, but Anita Hill made some accusations against Clarence Thomas, and if you type in Clarence Thomas's name now, you still see Anita Hill linked to that. If you go to YouTube and type in Clarence Thomas, you'll see that they have had done videos, documentaries, films, all sorts of things where they always take her side, even though nothing of it was ever really proven. Then, of course, Charles Cook goes on to say it would be pseudocidal because it would ensure that 11th hour efforts would be marshaled against every qualified nominee until the end of time. So resigning, maybe not necessarily. So that brings me to my other piece, then we'll take some phone calls by David French, in which he takes this seriously, and we do too. We've published, matter of fact, our May issue of Outlook was on the Me Too movement. And he says, don't count me among those who would minimize this alleged assault. He said, I went to high school that had more than its share of drunken parties, and my classmates would do crazy and stupid things, but an act like this was beyond the pale. This isn't boys being boys. Actions have consequences, but it's hardly unjust to tell a person that if he has mistreated another human being like this, even a long time ago, he has to remain merely a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And so he says he has a standard. I'll give you the 3-point standard, and you can see if you agree or disagree. But he says, I have the same standard that I have for Brett Kavanaugh as I did for Roy Moore, for Donald Trump, or for Bill Clinton, or for any other politician who's accused of misconduct, and trying to determine whether or not that is indeed true. He says, given the totality of evidence, he says, I believe more than likely than not that Bill Clinton committed rape and sexual harassment. Perhaps you saw the piece that Juanita Broderick posted, because when Dick Durbin said, if the Me Too movement has taught us anything, it is that we must respect and listen to survivors of sexual assault, regardless of the age of those involved or when the alleged attack took place. Juanita Broderick posted next to it, well, Dick, I have a story. Once upon a time, Bill Clinton raped me. Of course, Kathleen Woolley and others could put that there. So that one is pretty easy to establish. Then David French says, I believe more than likely that Donald Trump has committed sexual assault, and I believe that more than likely that Roy Moore engaged in sexual misconduct with underage girls. And so he says, why do I say those things? You can agree or disagree, but first of all, he says, one way to help test the veracity of old claims is to ask whether there are any contemporaneous corroboration. In other words, did the accuser tell a family member, a friend, anybody about this? After almost 3 decades of silence, then we have, of course, Mrs. Ford coming forward in a particular detail that was in 2012. But again, that's 36 years worth since then to now. But again, the other point that he makes is the alleged corroborating notes of the therapist raise a separate problem. They actually contradict her story on some key details. The notes say 4 boys. She said, well, that was an error on the therapist's part. Now she says 2. There's some other issues that you can talk about. And again, the article goes into it in some detail. And finally, his third point, first point is, no contemporaneous contemporaneous corroboration. The corroborating notes seem to sometimes disagree. But the third and final point, I think, relevant as well. There are no other allegations of sexual misconduct against Kavanaugh. He said if there's one thing we've seen time and again, it's that one allegation often triggers a cascade of additional claims. Well, we now know that this individual says that she is willing to testify before the Congress, so we'll see what happens there. And, of course, we've also heard that Judge Kavanaugh wants to actually deal with this issue as well, and he said that he's willing to testify. So we will see where this takes us, but let's, if we can, take some phone calls and give you a chance to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to California. Mary, what's your point of view?
Hello. My point of view is that the Democratic Party's gone hog wild with sexual allegations against anybody and everybody that they feel is a threat to their party. That's it. They just drag these people up one right after another. Look, I was 9 years old when I was raped by an older family member, okay? I know what pain it is. I know what it is to live with it. But I can tell you that I don't believe this woman. I really don't. And I think it should just go ahead and confirm him as a Supreme Court justice. For one thing, it gives him a better understanding of cases that are going to come before him in regards to this kind of stuff after being accused falsely himself. I think that, and you got to know that Judy Aldred working for the ACLU, you know, that's a communist organization right there. So that's not even going to be of any benefit to anybody American, I can tell you. But I don't believe her. I think that Judge Kavanaugh is being unfairly accused. And every time the Democratic Party wants to put somebody down, they pull out this rape accusation. You know, I didn't see where they were shooting anything about Bill Clinton when he was in the Oval Office with Monica Lewinsky.
Yeah, I was bringing that one up. Of course, Juanita Broderick and Kathleen Willing, some of the others. Let me give some others a chance to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. But one of the questions I want to put on the table is, has this worked? We now have Jeff Flake of Arizona, who's told Politico that he's not comfortable voting yes on the nomination until we've learned more from Ms. Ford. And then you now have Senator Bob Corker from Tennessee, who's made a similar kind of statement. So it does seem to me that this was maybe something that a few individuals were waiting for, so they didn't have to either cast an up or down vote on Judge Kavanaugh. So we'll see where that is. And I did mention just in passing that if you haven't been paying attention to this, Judge Brett Kavanaugh's mother, Margaret Kavanaugh, actually was involved in litigation. This was a foreclosure case which involved the parents of Christine Blasey, who's now Christine Blasey Ford. That happened in 1996. So some people have wondered about that as well. So those are just a couple of issues. And let me just, before we take some more phone calls after the break, mention that some people have said, well, what about that letter that came out in which you had 50, or I guess it was 65 women who knew Brett Kavanaugh in high school and said, this does not look like him. There was a very good piece that was put out by Virginia Hume. You might say, that sounds familiar. That was Brett Hume's daughter. And some people allege that this was put together early. And she said, no, we learned about the letter from a friend and fellow signatory and put this together very quickly. So the fact that it came out just almost the next day after some of the allegations from Dianne Feinstein illustrate how quickly the internet works. She says, to those who responded to my tweet saying I knew Brett in high school and asked if I had gender reassignment surgery, she says, come on, you know, I went to an all-girls school in Bethesda. He went to an all-boys school in Bethesda. We were permitted upon occasion to speak to people of the opposite sex. And then finally, to those hearing black helicopters saying, well, my father's a journalist, she said, well, in a group of 65 graduates of D.C. area schools, it would be odd not to find someone related to a working journalist or politician. It's not remarkable at all. And finally she said, to the one person who said I'm too young to know Brett Kavanaugh, truly I thank you from the bottom of my heart. So you have those 65 women who say, we've seen nothing like this in Brett Kavanaugh. But when we come back, we'll take some more phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Kaporos literally means atonement and has been a religious tradition of Orthodox Jews for over 2,000 years. On the eve of Yom Kippur, some Orthodox Jews will recite scripture and then swing a live chicken over their head while reciting a prayer like, "This is my substitute, this is my exchange, this is my atonement. This fowl will go to death, and I will enter upon a good and long life." The chicken is then butchered in the kosher fashion, and the meat of the chicken is then often donated to those in need of food. The ceremony invites the participants to contemplate their own mortality and appreciate the atonement of their sins. The Alliance to End Chicken as Kaporos does not like this practice. They sued the Jewish community in New York City, arguing that the practice violated sanitation and public nuisance laws. The Manhattan judge presiding over the case wasn't buying it. Judge Deborah James concluded that there was insufficient evidence to demonstrate that Kaporos was a public nuisance, and she refused to judicially stop the 2,000-year religious tradition. The Alliance to End Chickens as Kaporos may not like it, but the First Amendment is a high bar protecting even peaceful minority religious rituals involving chickens. That bar should not be lowered unless there is a clear, compelling reason to do so. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We'll take some more phone calls. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Statement so far from Judge Brett Kavanaugh is this. This is completely false allegation. I have never done anything like what the accuser describes to her or to anyone. Because this never happened, I had no idea who was making this accusation until she identified herself yesterday. So the judge said he would be willing to speak and wants to speak before the judiciary panel in any way the committee deems appropriate in order to what? He said, defend my integrity. So this reminds us a little bit of what some of us that are older saw take place where Clarence Thomas was accused by Anita Hill. We'll see what happens with whether or not there's testimony by Christine Blasey Ford. And, of course, we know there'll be testimony by Judge Brett Kavanaugh. This has turned into a circus, and if you want to read more about that, we have posted some articles, including my commentary today, on whether or not we should even have these confirmation hearings because they've turned into such a circus, which apologies to those of you that actually work in a circus. Let's go to Georgia. Kim, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yeah, I was just wanting to say, in the case of these so-called victims who don't come forward till 20, 30 years after the fact, at some point, I believe that women need to hold themselves accountable for all the potential victims that's happened in the meantime. Maybe not with this this incident, but with Donald Trump, with the Bill Cosby, anybody who ever comes up.
That's what we said, yeah.
Yeah, like,
our May issue of Outlook, I didn't want to blame.
Young women have been assaulted.
Yeah, I don't want to blame the victims, but I want them to recognize that when they don't come forward, then there's a potential that other people will suffer as they have suffered. So I don't want that to be perceived as blaming the victims at all, but there is a consequence to not speaking up. And I think your point is really well taken. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. And, I mean, it just gives no accountability to their story or their accusations. And this is a man's career we're talking about. He's worked hard his whole life to become this, and this happened in high school. But I don't even see why it should be.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point that I'll get to with some of the other callers in just a second, and that is we have an individual that was being considered for the Ninth Circuit Court, and because of something he said when he was writing in I think it was a newspaper editorial at Stanford as a college student, that was enough to disqualify him from the Ninth Circuit Court. There's got to be somewhere some kind of statute of limitations recognizing that young 20-somethings, teenagers do some things. I'm not excusing it, but this just gets a little bit farther out of field. And as we've said before, if indeed Judge Kavanaugh is innocent of this, and there's reason to believe that he may indeed, this will follow him the rest of his life. One accusation will follow him and has already affected his reputation. He wants to, defend his integrity. But let's take some more phone calls because so many of you would like to weigh in with your comments. South Carolina, Good News Network. Mike, what would you add to our conversation today?
Hey, Kirby, love you so. I would add that, someone's innocent until proven guilty, and her facts are definitely, I don't see anything in her fact that would prove someone guilty. If she can't remember the time, the place, the house, I don't see how, that's going to prove someone guilty.
It is hard to prove a negative, and as I've said, this is almost a bulletproof accusation because she said the date was around the end of her sophomore year, but she was not sure who owned the house or how she got there. So if you're Judge Brett Kavanaugh, how do you disprove that? You say, well, okay, this happens in late spring or summer of 1982, but it can't be narrowed down to a particular month. If she says, well, this happened in June, and he says, wait a minute, I was with my father and mother and we went to Europe, or if this was in May, he might say, well, I was part of the Model UN and I was in New York because we were doing a group there. Or if she says, well, this happened at the Hill House, well, I've never been to the house of Bob and Mary Hill. But when it's so vague, how do you disprove that other than just stand up and say this didn't happen?
That's my point. She can't prove it did happen, so he should be innocent until she can prove it actually did happen.
And unfortunately, right now, we have guilty unless proven innocence in the court of public opinion. And if you don't think so, you watch the late-night talk shows and see if they don't treat Brett Kavanaugh in very disrespectful ways tonight. We'll see where that goes, but I'm pretty sure of that. Let's go to, stay in Georgia for just a minute, WLPE. And Pam, what would you add to our conversation today?
Hey, Kirby, by the way, I read your article online today, and I agree with you. I think we need to do away with the confirmation hearings because they're ridiculous. This Me Too is a bunch of preachers. Most of these women are diabolical, and I don't put any stock in any of the stuff that they come out with, but it sounds like this woman has an axe to grind with Brett Kavanaugh over maybe someone in his family, and she's a lifelong Democrat. She admitted to that. And I'm also wondering, why did idiot Dianne Feinstein hold on to this and not immediately turn it over to the FBI if she was so convinced? She is somebody who should be investigated herself. But I think Brett Kavanaugh is, he should not have to endure this. The Senate should immediately confirm him. I don't see that there's any need. No rape occurred, and the woman admitted that there was no rape. And so I'm just wondering, and she couldn't remember where it was, when it was. First she said there were 4 people, then there were 2.
I think she's made the whole thing up out of whole cloth. And if they're going to take this seriously, then that's going to be everything. Every time Trump tries to appoint a judge, this is what's going to happen. They're just going to use that. And I think it's a disgrace and a shame. And I think the Democrat Party, I wish I could be president for 1 year. I would outlaw the Democrat Party totally.
You wouldn't be allowed to do so, and you shouldn't be. But, I mean, again, I know it's the frustration here. And, again, I recognize that we have a lot of younger listeners, and they're going, I didn't read some about this in the history books, because you had in 1987 Judge Robert Bork, who was vilified by Ted Kennedy, saying that he was going to allow back alley abortions, that he was going to re-implement Jim Crow laws, and just completely borked his reputation. And then you had in the 1990s the Clarence Thomas case, which, again, for a lot of our young people, they've never experienced any of this, where Anita Hill was brought forward with allegations. And I might say for our young people, you know what the allegations were that were so controversial? Well, that Clarence Thomas supposedly talked about pornography with her. Yes, that was really controversial back then. As a matter of fact, we even had one nominee in the 1980s that had to step down because he, if you can believe this, smoked marijuana. That was enough to be disqualifying. So some of our millennials just have to be shaking their heads saying, really, that was the issue back then? And, of course, now, once again, somebody brought forward. And you've got to wonder the implications that this might mean. Even if indeed the nomination goes through, I'm thinking that President Donald Trump, if he wants to appoint another person to the Supreme Court and has that opportunity, maybe he reaches for somebody like Amy Coney Barrett. They couldn't accuse her, I think, of doing anything that would be involved in a sexual assault. But again, this has changed the nature of the confirmation process. And my commentary today said maybe we need to get rid of these confirmation hearings. For those of you that don't know our history, I think it was Justice William O. Douglas. He just submitted his papers. There wasn't even a hearing. And now these have turned into a circus. And this week it's going to be a real circus. So that's why we've got Manuel Miranda coming in tomorrow, because he's going to talk about all the things he had to endure because they postponed his hearings. And so we'll get into a lot of very important issues tomorrow, but it'll have to be tomorrow because we're simply out of time. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Join us tomorrow on Point of View. You know we'll have a lot more to talk about then. We'll see you then.
Go mobile with Point of View and take transformation with you on the go. Search in Google Play or the Apple Store for Point of View Radio, the Point of View Radio mobile app. Download it free today.
Good news. You are not stuck with your health care plan. Really. You have a choice, and it's a great one. It's called MediShare, and if you've heard about it and wondered what exactly it is, it's a way that people share their health care bills. And these are people who have a common faith, who want to be part of something beautiful that not only meets their healthcare needs, but the needs of others too. And it's people who love to save money, big time. MediShare members typically save $500 a month per family on their healthcare costs. That is a life changer for people. So this could be for you. Maybe it's what you've been looking for, a way to pay healthcare bills that's not only very smart financially, but it's even profound. MediShare is a nonprofit with 400,000 members nationwide who pray for and share with each other. So yes, you're not stuck. There's another way, and it could save you a lot. Find out more. Call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover.